Okay, so we'll move on. We've got Jarrod from Consumer Building and Occupational Services to talk to next. Thank you.
So my name's Jarrod. How do I get that presentation up?
There we go.
So my name's Jarrod Meehan. I'm from Consumer Building and Occupational Services. We're Tasmania's building regulator. If I can get this. So today I'm just going to try and take you through a fairly general overview of Tasmania's building legislation, basically how it operates, who the key players are, and some of the requirements. So Consumer Building Occupational Services is a business output of the Department of Justice. As I said, we administer the state's building regulations and appendix of the National Construction Code. We also administer the Building Act and the Occupational Licensing Act. So part of our function under that service is we have a compliance arm, and we also have an advisory arm to advise consumers and anyone in the building industry or other stakeholders on how the regulatory system works. So, as I mentioned, we regulate or administer the Building Act. There's three main or key components of the Building Act. So we have administrative processes which set out who can do what. So we have a Director of Building Control, building surveyors, permit authorities and other parties to work such as owners, builders and designers. It sets out the processes you need to follow for building approvals. And I'll go through a bit more of that later, but it's a risk-based process, and we have low risk, medium risk and high risk work. And each of them will have a separate different buildings process. And then we have the technical requirements, which in Tasmania, all building work must comply with the National Construction Code. That's in place at the time. And I guess it's also one of the questions we ask quite a lot as a building regulator is we're quite separate from planning. So there's two distinct approvals processes. There's planning approvals and also building approvals. And we at CBOS only administer the building approval. So any planning issues or questions, really, your local council is the best place position to answer any of those. So I'll go through some of the roles in the process. We have the Director of Building Control. So the Director of Building Control oversees the administration of the Act. He liaises with ministers, industry bodies, practitioners and consumers about how the Building Act works and changes to the Building Act. He issues determinations which are subordinate. Just realised I'm not talking about that probably. Subordinate to the Building Act, however they are mandatory. And he also issues guidance documents and fact sheets to help industry and consumers out. He can, one of his other roles is also he can audit any licensed practitioner that operates under the Building Act. The next one we have in a system of building surveyors. Building surveyors play a key role in the Act. Their primary role is to ensure compliance with the Building Act and the National Construction Code. They do this by assessing designs of the licensed practitioners. They perform inspections during the building work and on completion, and they can issue compliance directions, notices and orders depending on how non-compliant the work is or if there is non-compliant work. And then they also issue certificates of occupancy, and on certain projects they'll also issue the completion certificates to close out the project. So the next regulatory role we have, or the third regulatory role, is permit authorities. So they reside at the local council. Similar to building surveyors, they're required to ensure compliance with the Building Act and the National Construction Code. I'll touch on it a bit later, but they also issue building permits for the highest risk category of work. They also have a similar role to building surveyors in a process, however they are more in line with the plumbing. So as a building surveyor assesses building work against the National Construction Code and the Building Act, the permit authority will actually assess the plumbing work against the National Construction Code and the Building Act. And they also have a role in issuing compliance orders, so for illegal work or fire hazard buildings or dilapidated buildings, they do the compliance work on those. So lastly on the list I have owners. Now owners don't have a regulatory role, but they do have responsibilities under the Building Act. So owners are responsible for applying for approvals. They're also responsible for engaging the licensed practitioners, including the licensed building surveyor. So the licensed building surveyor is always the owner's choice, and building surveyors are there to work in the owner's and public's interest. So they're there when you engage them to work for you. So the last thing, owners also have a role in a protection work process. I won't go into that into detail today, but it's a process that if the building work on your site potentially can affect your adjoining owners, there's a process in place to put protection in place and insurance, so if something does go wrong, there's something in place to protect your adjoining owner. As I said, one of the owner's responsibilities is to ensure that all licensed practitioners, all practitioners they engage are licensed. So that includes a building surveyor, your designers, architects, engineers, that type of thing. Available on our website is a license search function, so you can go to the CBOS website and search out an individual practitioner to see what they're actually licensed in. So as I mentioned earlier, the Director of Building Control can issue determinations under the Building Act, which are mandatory documents. The Building Act is a risk-based system. We have medium risk work, high risk work, and I should have said low risk work at the start. Each of those has a different approvals process. So low risk work, there's two categories. Low risk work by an owner's really low level work. It's generally maintenance type work, very small structures. It slowly works its way up to licensed builders, so they can do smaller sheds, that type of thing. So the two low risk work categories don't have an approvals process. On some of them you have to notify council when you're finished, but that's it. So the two though that would probably most affect everyone in this room are notifiable work and permit work. So new commercial buildings or alterations or additions to commercial buildings are generally going to fall into either notifiable or permit work depending on the type of work involved. Both of those have a rigorous approvals process. You need licensed practitioners, so you need licensed designers, licensed building surveyor to assess the work, and a licensed builder to perform the work. And for permit work, you need a building permit off the local council. So, also with the categories of work document, there's also a complementary plumbing version. So plumbing is also divided into categories, risk categories, similar to building work, and that's where the permit authority will assess that type of work. So one question we get asked quite a lot is, how does the Building Act apply to existing buildings? So essentially, once you build a building legally, have it approved and build it legally, it remains legal for its life. The National Construction Code can change, standards can change, but if your building work was approved legally, it stays that way. The exceptions to that are all new building work, alterations, additions or extensions or a new building must comply with the current National Construction Code. The exception that applies to not having to upgrade your building is if you do building work in a 3-year period that affects more than 50% of your existing building, your entire building needs bringing up to the current standards. And that also applies if you're changing the use of your building from one use to another use. So for example, you're changing a barn to a distilling process or a storage facility, that'll change your building from a class 10 to likely a class 7 or 8, which brings in totally new requirements, and that entire building will need upgrading. So I'll just give a general overview of the building approvals process. So as I said before, we don't regulate planning, but it's always the first port of call to check what you're actually allowed to do on your building site. The first people to, I guess, engage are licensed designers. Like I said before, changes to commercial buildings or new commercial buildings will be notifiable of permit work, which will require licensed practitioners. The next person to engage is a licensed building surveyor. Once the licensed designers have done their work, the plans are ready, the building surveyor is then ready to assess those plans against the National Construction Code and ensure that they comply. They'll also assess whether the work is the notifiable work or the high risk work requiring a building permit off the council, and they're the ones that will decide that and let you know that, and then it's the owner's responsibility to apply for that permit from the council. Once you have all your approvals in place, you're required to have a licensed builder to do the work for notifiable permit work. The requirement for the builder is that the builder must build off the approved plan. So as happens in life, there's deviations during the construction process. If there's a deviation in the construction process that would have affected the work that the building surveyor approves, i.e. Compliance with the National Construction Code, that change in design must go back through the designer, be reassessed by the building surveyor prior to the builder actually doing that work. There's a couple of good reasons for that. It ensures that the work is compliant prior to it being built, but it also helps the variation process between the owner and the builder. And then during construction, the building surveyor inspects the work, and on completion, either the building surveyor or the council will then issue a certificate of completion and the work's finalised. So part of the reporting or approvals process are reporting authorities. So the Building Act has 3 reporting authorities. We have environmental health officers, the Disability Commissioner, and the Chief Officer of Tasmanian Fire Service, which is probably the most relevant one for today. So for notifiable permit building work, if there are any fire safety features involved in that work, and it would be very rare that there wouldn't, one of the requirements is that the building surveyor must request a report off the chief officer. The chief officer, once requested for a report, then can offer their opinion on the functionality of that building with respect to the National Construction Code and how the TFS will operate. And they also have the ability then to tell the applicant whether they need an evacuation plan under general fire regulations. So I've mentioned a few times that compliance with the National Construction Code is required for all new work. I'll just give a quick overview of how the National Construction Code works. I know the presenter from the TFS is going to go into a lot more detail of this later on. So the National Construction Code sets the minimum performance requirements for all building work in Australia. It's generally called up in all jurisdictions building acts. It sets the safety, health, amenity, accessibility and sustainability for buildings to ensure that they're actually fit for occupation. It has 3 volumes. So volume 1 is a volume that would affect most people in this room for the purposes of operating a distillery, which is, I guess, oversees the technical requirements of all commercial work. So building classes 2 to 9, so anything from apartment buildings to office buildings to schools to factory processes, storage facilities, healthcare buildings are all covered in volume 1. Volume 2 is quite specific to class 1s and 10s, which is your residential dwellings and associated sheds and retaining walls, that type of thing. And then volume 3 is the Plumbing Code of Australia, which is specific to plumbing and covers plumbing work for all classes of buildings. So there's several ways you can comply with the National Construction Code. The first and I guess most often used ways are deemed to satisfy provisions. They're kind of like a set formula or recipe. If you follow the steps, you're deemed to comply. The second way is a performance solution. There's a lot more flexibility in a performance solution. They're used reasonably regularly, particularly around fire engineers. And they offer a lot more flexibility. All you've got to do is prove that you meet the performance requirements of the code, but there are quite stringent, what we call evidence of suitability, to prove that you've meeting those performance requirements. And then you can use a combination of either solution. One of the, I guess, inquiries we get quite a lot is, I guess I was going to say arguments, discussions over what classification a building is. Under the Building Act, ultimately, the person who has a final say on the classification of a building under the National Construction Code is the building surveyor, so he's the arbitrator of any disputes. And then once a building class is set, then all the other requirements flow from that. And probably the last thing I'd like to cover, there are responsibilities post-construction for all owners of commercial buildings. So one of the determinations I mentioned earlier was the prescribed essential building services maintenance of determination. So it basically sets out maintenance requirements for all what we call essential building services listed in the building regulations. There's quite a lot. I've listed a few, I guess, of the more important, or I shouldn't say more important, but the more, I guess, ones that are more pertinent to safety of buildings on the screen. But there's also ones around maintenance of bushfire requirements or access and egress for disability, that type of thing. So this is required on every commercial building. The building surveyor will actually put it together usually around occupancy. Once the building's finished and they know exactly what's going in the building and they certify it, it needs to be updated or, I guess, checked every year to make sure that it's still current. And if it's not, it can be updated, and again, then the building surveyor has to recertify that. So it's something that quite often gets overlooked, but quite important for the maintenance life of a building. So that sort of ends my presentation today. Hopefully that's just given a good general overview of the Building Act and the building regulations. At CBOS, we also have an advisory service, so we can advise industry practitioners, consumers on the Building Act regulations, National Construction Code, and all how that works. I'll leave those contact details I had up there earlier on some business cards, so if anyone does have any inquiries, they can get in contact with us or our advisory service. Thanks. Thank you for your time.
Was there any questions from that last session?
Talk about risk.
Yep.
What do you mean by risk? Is it what's the building used for? Is it
No, it's
construction
more-
methods? What risk?
It's a bit of everything. So, trying to think of some good examples. So, low risk work would be general maintenance. So you get up on your roof and you've got to replace your roof sheeting because it's rusted out. So that's low risk work. It's not. So it's a little bit to do with what the work is and how it's carried out. So it includes like small sheds. So an owner can put up a shed, I think off the top of my head, about 18 square metres. Once it gets over that, then you need a licensed builder up to a certain point. And then obviously the bigger the shed is, the more risk in, I guess, the safety, the design of the shed and the construction of the shed. So then once it gets over that certain size, you would then need a building surveyor and licensed builders to perform the work, sort of thing. So it's a bit of everything. It's a bit of the class of the building, the use of the building, how it's constructed and the size of it. It was put together about, I think it's end of 2016 with consultation with a lot of practitioners and industry, builders, that type of thing. So had engineers involved, architects, master builders, HIA, all that. So it's sort of, yeah, it's encompasses, tries to encompass all of that, if that helps. Sure, I think. This slide is actually only a snippet. I don't know how to get that back up. The slide's only a snippet of about a 100-page document. So it's really just a general overview, see if I can read it, of the basics of each one. So I can send a document that's got all the requirements. So the document, or the main document, sets out practitioners who can do the work, whether it's an owner, whether it's a builder, whether you need building surveyors, that type of thing to do the work, licensed designers, and the approvals process for each. Oops, that one. Yeah. It's a category low risk by name. Yeah, so. Yeah. Yep. No, that's right. So you'll find when you have a look at the main document, it does separate some out by class, but it's generally saying that new commercial buildings are category 3, or new residential buildings are category 3, or a shed that's small will be category 2, so they're a class 10. It'll separate, claommercial buildings, class 2 to 9 will be a certain category, that type of thing. So. Yep. Yep. There is when the class has got 2 different building classes. So your shed that you're storing your car or your tractor is probably going to be a class 10, whereas one for a bond store, it's going to depend on each situation. That's where the building survey comes in, but it's probably going to be a class 7. So there would be slightly different requirements for that. Yeah. Yeah, because in the NCC, different class buildings are going to have different requirements. So your shed that stores your car and that type of thing in it won't have sprinklers or anything like that, or fire safety requirements, whereas a class 7, depending on the size, what you're storing in it, the volume of the shed, if it's a rise in stories or not, will have different fire rating requirements. You might need hydrants, and that's why, so it's a different class. Even though it's just a shed, there's other features in it that make it a higher risk installation, so you need licensed people to design it. Yeah. There's a more comprehensive document on our website that you can download, and any questions, you're more than welcome to call or email. Yep. 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 Look, at the end of the day, it is a building surveyor's call on the class of building and also what category of work it will fall into. Yeah, at the end of the day. You can appeal it, but then that's a process that needs to go to, I was going to say RIMPAT, but TASCAT now is Appeals Tribunal. So you can appeal the decision, but you're appealing the decision of an expert in the area. That's going to be yeah. And they know all the requirements, NCC, that type of thing, so, yeah.
Requirements for our class of building. Is it a one-shoe-fits-all situation?
No, it's not, and I think Daniel from TFS is going to go into that a little bit in a lot more detail, but no, it's the requirements for building, they're affected by a lot of factors: the size, the volume, the type of material you're storing in it.
You had 2 buildings, 2 identical distilleries, one in an industrial area and one in a 800-acre farm.
Yep.
would they have to have the same?
If they're identical, yes.
Why is that?
Uh,
I mean, our situation is if you're in an industrial area, you're going to have a professional
Yep.
firefighting service
Yep.
within a couple of minutes. Where we are, we're 45 minutes to an hour. We should really only have to supply enough water to put out the ashes. I mean, why have $100,000
It doesn't distinguish,
that
yeah.
will not be used?
Look, it doesn't distinguish between where the building is. It's based on the requirements of the actual building and class. That's a question. And there's always performance solution pathway that's available that you can look at things like that. There's no guarantees that it would change anything, but you can get a fire engineer involved and look at certain aspects of it. Yeah. There are pathways for that type of thing.
They don't seem quite practical because we can come up with an equivalent standard.
Yep.
Now, the standard of safety in the building in an industrial area is completely different to the standard in mine because there's no one there to use the service in mine. So do I only have to produce a safety standard equivalent to no fire service for an hour?
No, but one of the goals of the National Construction Code is to protection of a building as well. It's not just the people in it, it's also the protection of the building. So
Well,
they're built to the same, if they're essentially identical, the requirements will be identical.
Yeah, my question is, should they be in those two circumstances?
Like I said, there's always, if you want to try something different, there's always a performance solution pathway, and that you just need the right consultants to have a look at that in the right manner. You still have to set the same, you still have to meet the same requirements, but you can do it in a different way if you can prove that your method is equivalent to what they want. Yep.
Thank you. Thank you for those questions.